Welcome to Overthinking It, where we subject the popular culture to a level of scrutiny it probably doesn't deserve. We are recapping Mad Men Season 6, Episode 11, and though we have always been unlovable, we are glad that you love us. I'm Matt Rather, that is Pete Fenzel. Hi,
Wait,
Pete.
what? Oh, jeez, you walked in on me in a really awkward moment.
All right. Well, I'm going to sit at the dinner table and just simmer. Just
Hey, Matt, my knee.
yeah.
I'm touching your knee with my knee right now. Is that you ever wonder when you podcast with someone and you just really podcast with them, whether you like learn to, and it's true love can happen. Yeah.
Pete, I'll give you a month's pay.
Degenerate. Awesome.
I mean, it's he doesn't have the Campbell doesn't have the moral weight that Don has when he looks at Sal and says, "You people," right? Like that was chilling.
Because Pete doesn't actually hate them, and Don kind of actually hates them.
Well, yeah, sure. we mean homosexuals, of course, and so if you have been wondering, as we've been wondering, what the hell is up with Bob?
Oh, you need to explain. You need to explain to the podcast people who are getting this why they're getting it in their feed.
We're actually not going to put this one out on the podcast. Okay. We're only going to put the season finale out.
Oh, right, that's right, because there's a couple more episodes of Mad Men, which is awesome.
Yeah. So if you're watching this, you're watching it as a video, which is awesome. Welcome. You can see me. Doop-a-doop-a-doop-a-doo. It's a visual medium.
Yep.
All right. So the what is that?
It's a Beanie Baby moose. It's this mascot of my college dorm that my sister gave me on my graduation, and I keep it by my desk.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
What do I keep by my desk? I have a USB drive. I mean, do you want to start with Sally? Do you want to start with Sally's discovery?
I feel like we have to, right?
Yeah. Because that's the thing. Now, poor Sally, right? I wonder if you've been able to see her running the bases, right? Like she must have seen someone kiss early on, and then she saw Roger and Megan's mom doing what they were doing, and now
fellatio is the word, Matt. The word is fellatio.
A fillet show? Is that like a meat distributor? Shows you all their fillets?
Something like that. That's kind of how.
The and now her own father cheating on his second wife with the mother. I mean, this is an extraordinarily complex psychosexual, tangled stuff. Cheating with the mother of a boy that she is kind of supposed to have a crush on, but doesn't really, but is getting kind of goaded into it before she's sort of truly ready by her, by her friend who's, who is a horrible little brat.
Yes. Sally is not. Sally is awesome.
Yeah, and Sally, even in the moments when she has been horrible, and she's had her moments.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense given the lack of good parenting. I mean, a minute ago on the Mad Men recap, we were talking about good parenting, right? And on the Game of Thrones recap, I mean to say, right? She's a budding Cersei, right?
Yeah.
She's got Tywin Lannister as a parent or something.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's intense. I mean, it's also really sad that this is the time that Dawn gets caught, right? Like this is the one that she sees, because it's not particularly representative of Dawn's infidelities over the years, right? Like Dawn's relationship with Sylvia was
because this one is based on a kind of a spontaneous outpouring of powerful feeling around the draft storyline, and not this kind of systematic series of infidelities.
Well, it's also because it's about Sylvia and it's not about Dawn, which is not how none of these things have been for Dawn, right? Where it's he didn't go into getting Mitchell out of the draft in order to get sex with Sylvia. He was doing it out of a sense of guilt, out of a sense of wanting to do something right, kind of wanting to set right accounts, and wanting to kind of ingratiate himself to her and kind of heal that wound. But I don't think he was doing it for the sexy times, because we had sort of figured out earlier that he kind of gotten past his sexual relationship with Sylvia, and so he goes through all that to kind of like help to try to sort of be a good person, and some sort of resemblance of what he thinks a good person might do. And then she's so overwhelmed by the situation. Like there's a moment where he's talking to her on the phone, and the moment where she says, you were so much better, like I was so much worse to you than you were to me, or whatever, however she specifically frames it. And he sort of like takes out a cigarette and takes a drag on it, because it's like, that's not how I remember it. Like I remember that I was much worse to you than you were to me. So so okay, you're telling me about your perspective, which is something I haven't really paid attention to previously.
Right.
And when he says to Sally that he was comforting her, I mean, he's lying, and he's lying in such a horrible, heartbreaking way. But there must be some sense in which that's some thread of a part of what's happening, right? And that like this is something that happened under extreme circumstances between people who had an intense history, and in a time of like mental and emotional exhaustion. And so, whereas like it's not like it's forgivable, but it's like so many of the other times that Don had sex with other women, it was just for his own selfish reasons, right? It was like his own psychosexual problems. You would almost get a sense that Sally would come to understand Don better if he'd walked in with her, if she'd walked in on him with like Bobby, right? Or if not their kid, but not the son, but with like the woman he tied to the bed, or if he like walked in on him with one of his secretaries on his at work. Right, or something like with Megan when they were still dating before she left her, before they decided to get married publicly and all that stuff. Like there's so many other times where what he was doing was so much more characteristic of what he does, but this one is so bound up in pain, right? And like this moment is so bound up in her also, right, in her personal relationships, that it's really unfortunate that this is the one that she sees. It's tragic and sad, right? Like and I mean I think that when he closes the door at the end of that shot where he like leaves her room and he goes into his own room and closes the door. I've read in a couple commentaries that this recalls Roger's speech after his kind of relationship with his wife is over, and he's trying to come to terms with that. And it's like life is a series of doors that you walk through and close behind you, and you can't go back again.
Yeah.
Extra sad, right? And it's so yeah. I mean that was my immediate reaction to it, was that it's like it is an unlikely one for Sally to witness, and it is especially painful one for Sally to witness, and a painful one for Don to have her witness, and something that destroys their relationship probably.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Wow.
I mean, what do you think?
It probably
no.
Well, I think, and this is like, I'm sort of like reading into her psychology. I'm sort of treating the character as though she were, a real person. But like, this is like an elaborate series of traumas, that this character has been undergoing, and they've been happening to her at sort of the time when she is most vulnerable to, what I mean, at like these most sort of formative developmental moments. Right in like child development, the divorce, the fellatio where she goes in and sees a fillet dancing around, and the right, and the sort of primal scene, this sort of like perversion of the primal scene, right? Because like the primal scene, if you see your parents doing it, at least it's your parents and they love each other, you know what I mean? This is a sort of nuclear annihilation of the idea of stable family and loyalty and and yet it was done. It's just so, I don't know, it's just so confusing. And like if it doesn't, this I don't know, like it's either going to make a psychoanalyst very, very rich, right, half a dozen years hence, when maybe she can go to the same shrink that Betty went to in the first season of Mad Men, and Don can get notes on what's going on. But this is sort of going to I don't know, issue in some stuff, and I wonder if she's like, this is like the legacy of the '60s is like free love or I don't know, all that stuff is sort of done now, though. But that this, that this is the kind of downside of that, right? This is the sort of, I don't know, this is the sort of human cost of that we see with
I mean,
Sally.
yeah, to a degree. I mean, like as you're talking, I want to contrast this, and I think talking about the '60s and this is especially important versus like the early '60s versus the late '60s.
Right.
When you're talking about like someone who underwent the nuclear annihilation of family and has been in this sort of very traumatic, very needy place. I mean, this is also what Pete Campbell is experiencing when his Raisin Bran is out, right? And it's like, there's this trauma that's of his own doing, and sort of a primal scene that he found himself looking at, right? When he sort of like witnesses the revelation about his infidelity with the neighbor, and she's all beat up, and now he's sort of cast out. Obviously, he's less sympathetic because it's his own fault and he's not a child. But it's the same idea of like we're out here kind of bereft of our family, of the way that our family ought to be supporting us, and what does this mean for our future? I mean, if you think about the way that Bob Benson kind of comes on to Pete, right? And maybe Bob Benson is gay. Maybe Bob Benson thinks Pete is gay and is trying to out him. Maybe there's something else weird that's going on. Like there's a lot of stuff that's potentially happening in that.
No, Bob's gay, right? Like the disappointment on his face as he's walking out.
Well, Matthew Weiner said an interesting thing on one of the videos that they posted on AMC, which was that he said that he isn't sure whether Bob Benson is gay or not, but it is clear that Bob Benson is infatuated with Pete for some reason. Now, it might be that he's just deliberately being obtuse to try to keep himself with options. It might also be that Bob Benson turns out to be a serial killer, right? And it's like he wants to be inside Pete because he wants to wear his skin or something like that. And there's been a lot through the season to imply that there's going to be a serial killer at some point. Including the episode of Hawaii Five-0 that everyone was watching, which I looked up. It turned out to be about like a serial killer killing a bunch of women. But at any rate, the main thing I wanted to take away from it is that, like, think of the horror and terror that Sal felt, right? Like when he was potentially discovered. Like when Sal was in the bar and the man was coming on to Sal, and he's like, "Do you have any idea how much like danger this puts me in?" And how scared he is. Versus Bob Benson, yeah, he's disappointed and he has to be careful because he could get himself in a lot of trouble, but that terror isn't quite there, right? And I mean, I was looking up the Stonewall riots on Wikipedia because those happened in 1969, and that's next year in Mad Men terms. And if Bob Benson is being introduced as a new character who happens to be gay, like maybe he'll be involved in the Stonewall riots, especially because he's conservative politically. Like maybe something will happen there. There was a quote from Allen Ginsberg about it where he talked about, I mean, he used the bad word that I won't repeat, but how like the gay men of the late 60s have a boldness and a confidence that they didn't have 10 years previous, right? Mm-hmm. That previously they looked horribly wounded and they'd been hurt and scared. And so if you connect this with Sally and her experience of the primal scene, to me, it sort of says like, the 60s have created this social change where people are bolder and less terrified of the consequences of their sexual exploits, right? We've sort of gone through a period of liberalization where, like think about the divorced woman, right, that Don gets with early on in Mad Men, and like the sort of like the way that people talked about her being divorced and just the attitude in the suburbs around her and the sense that everything around her was kind of bad, and the length that Don went to be very secretive about being with her. And also, I mean, part of this is the relocation of the show into New York from the sort of suburbs and New York dichotomy. Like maybe in the suburb it's still like that. We haven't really seen a lot of what's going on in society there. But like, I'm not convinced that these kind of things didn't happen and that these kind of things didn't wound people. Like clearly Don was really wounded by his experience, like seeing his stepmother having the sexual intercourse, and then getting beaten and all this other stuff. And presumably the farm and whorehouses and stuff where he grew up were more socially conservative areas than New York is. So these same traumas can keep recurring, but there is something about the 60s that's made people a little bit sloppier about how they do it. Like more likely to be caught, more likely to be discovered, and less afraid of the consequences for themselves, which perhaps makes it a greater danger to the kids. Perhaps, like you get the sense that if Sally were 10 years older, and Don were 10 years older, and they were doing this 10 years ago, he never would have gotten caught because the consequences of getting caught would have been so much worse.
Right.
for him, not for her, because she's still going to be traumatized. She's still going to have these psychological issues because of it. But for him, the real life consequences would have been much worse. And maybe that's sort of connecting with what you're talking about, I guess. I read.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking more about her. It's funny when we think about the '60s. I think of the early seasons of the show as being the '50s, though of course they weren't. They took place in the 1960s, and it like it calls to mind for me like what a short period of time what we think of as the '60s was, right? Because we've remarked, and we don't need to rehash it, but we've remarked that this season it feels like we're already into the '70s with this show and some of the decay, right? And the idea of like a shining moment of promise of social change, or you know what I mean, of with civil rights or with sort of altruism and the hippie stuff and stuff like that. This is all decaying now into the the deaths of civil rights leaders and riots at the riots at the Democratic National Convention, and Vietnam and like the very real threat of death, right? Like, well, Don was in the service, but it's different now. It would be different for what's the kid's name? Mitchell. Yeah. Mitchell. It would be for Mitchell to be drafted because he's soft, and, and that like I don't know. It's like Don was forged in the crucible of like tremendous hardship, and his kids weren't. Right, and the kids of the other people around him weren't, and there's, I don't know, that there's a sense that like, I don't know, there's a sense that they don't have maybe the same kind of toughness, right? They don't have the same kind of resources of resilience.
Although if you look at it, like, how is he actually done with the fact that he was exposed to such hardship? He's a high functioning alcoholic who can't maintain a successful relationship. He's cheating all over the place. He's kind of, pissing all over his job right now, causing a lot of pain and suffering to the people around him, right? And like, so there's this sense, and so when he's talking about going to war, he says, well, it's different because I wanted to go. And it's like, but then you got there, and he's like, yeah, right? So there's this sense that he was different because he didn't understand what he was getting himself into. But then if you look at the consequences of everything he's been through, they're all pretty bad, right? Like, I don't know how resilient you can say you are if you are, screwing up your life due to trauma to the degree that Don Draper screws up his life due to trauma. I mean, he puts on a show of being tough, but how resilient was he really? Right? Like what is the goal of, what is the thing that you're trying to protect? What is like the egg that you're wrapping in newspaper, right? That this resilience is supposed to protect. Is it just supposed to be that you can walk into the work with a suit on and you won't cry all the time? Right? Because that's a pretty low bar to jump over. And what's the actual value? And one of the things is this period of time is sort of asking, and we'll continue to ask, is like, well, what's the value of that? So it's like, it's almost sadder because Mitchell would know what he's getting into. But it remains to be seen whether it would actually be worse for him, right? Like, it's just that, like, we know we aren't able to convince ourselves that he would be fine, which we would be able to do back in the day when we didn't talk about this stuff and when we didn't have cameras in Vietnam. We couldn't see it. I mean, the other big story of this period of time is the rise of television. Right. Like, and then, like, Kennedy being a president you can see on TV, and that's why.
And how much, right? And how much, like, people have to watch television. And I think someone says with the riots in New York, or maybe the riots in Chicago or something, I feel like I can't turn it off. That's a really important development, and the amount of time that we now see stuff happening on screens, right? Like screens, and that kind of experience has become really important to the show this year.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess to sort of like jump the conversation into other parts of the show, we're all Don is cognizant of the things that Sally is not going to get that she needs, which is like this loving, supporting family environment that's been destroyed. We are cognizant of the things that Don isn't getting that he has needed this whole time, which was like a mother that cared for him when he was little, and like not to be living as a crazy like alternate identity of a dead guy, right? Like all of the things that have been motivating all of his behavior the whole season, his sort of trying to reconcile with his past. But the episode is also full of, and we've talked about a little bit about Bob Benson and Pete's needs. But everybody in this show is kind of reaching out to somebody else to try to have some need of theirs met. I mean, Peggy and the rat is like a great light example. That almost reminds me of like a Star Trek: The Next Generation B plot. I know we talk about Star Trek: The Next Generation a lot, but it's like, Picard has to go to the planet to like deal with this, divine entity that's judging people, and he has to unravel its riddle and save the life of this kid who's going to die. And meanwhile, like, Data has a cat. Right? Like,
yeah. You would never have the cat like dragging a bloody trail across the floor on Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? And that's the thing. I mean, there is this sort of blood stain, that has begun to kind of creep across the floor of Mad Men. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are speculating about serial killers and references to
who would do that?
Tate
That's crazy talk.
No. I mean, like, not just us, all over the internet, right? Like this discourse is taking place, and and my way of putting it is that, and I've said it on every episode, I think, is that we are on the long decline into the Warriors now, and that's where we are headed, into the war of all against all. In fact, the Mad Men universe is becoming Westeros, and Don has got to get with the program, because family is all you leave behind you.
If this thing ends with Pete Campbell in dungarees and a denim vest, like otherwise shirtless, trying to ride the train to Coney Island, and like fighting like aggressively themed gangs along the way, I feel like Mad Men will have accomplished its goal.
Right. Actually, Rockstar Games is going to put out another one in the series that it, of the kind of the Warriors, I forget what it was called, that it had, right? But it's going to be called Mad Men,
Beyond Thunderdome.
Right. And you can play as Dawn and lock a woman in a hotel room and take her book away.
I can't get past that. I just can't get past that.
That's but you know what, Pete? Imagine every time Ginger Rogers leapt in the air, Fred Astaire punched her in the face.
It is a funny image, which is unfortunate because it's such an awful misogynistic image and shouldn't be. I mean, if you flip it, it's not as funny. Imagine every time Fred Astaire jumped in the air, Ginger Rogers punched him in the face. No, that's funny still. That's still funny. Yeah, there's a lot of casual misogyny and chauvinism in Mad Men. I don't want to endorse it too much. But it is funny that Ted Chow describes himself as Ginger Rogers.
Right.
That is pretty funny.
Well, he's awfully pretty. I don't know, do you feel hopeful about him, about his marriage? Because he does sort of adjust, right? He does sort of manage to see outside of himself, which is something that Pete and Don and Peggy and none of these people can do, really. And there are kids here, the kids have needs, right? Yeah. And we're kind of, it's underlined, the point is sort of underlined and italicized with Peggy, with being reminded of her child with Pete, right? Yeah. That, I don't know, that she's that she's in some view, or in her most critical kind of view of herself, sort of a crappy parent, mm-hmm. right? That Ted can, go give his kids a piggyback ride and put them to bed. Yeah.
I mean, the thing where Ted was talking to his wife, and his wife was like, "I want you to be happy here." It reminds me of something that I think has gotten a bit lost in the show, which is that, as much as Don Draper, when he talks, is talking about himself and not about the people around him, he is right a lot of the time about, human nature, right? And so, when Don talks about, and this was sort of last season, right, happiness is the period right before you want more happiness, right? Isn't that what they said? And this idea that there's a sort of tragedy to life, in that, you're never really truly going to be content, and sure. and you have to sort of push on to the next thing, and this sort of ideal, a lot of the things that advertising is trying to sell you are kind of stopgap measures to make you feel better about things about your life that aren't really going to be better. Right. You have to deal with these facts of your life. And the difference is, of course, that Don Draper has all of these things turned up to 11 in his head, which is why one of the reasons he's so brilliant at articulating them. And the rest of us manage to muddle through. right? Like, and not the rest of us altogether. And I'm sure most people don't. We often don't feel like we muddle through, and we have our own problems and difficulties. But it's like, yeah, Ted Chow is feeling a certain scale of the kind of unhappiness that Don Draper feels, and has a certain amount of the dysfunction with his family that Don Draper has with his family, but less so. And it's important to sort of say, like, but less so. And it's like, will Ted ever really be happy at home to the point where it won't bother his wife anymore? Maybe not, right? Like, maybe there's always going to be part of him. He loves his work. He feels at home at the office. He likes working a lot. He likes advertising. He likes flying his airplane. He's, to an extent, he's a large child, like a lot of the people in advertising are in this show. And maybe in real life, maybe not. So is there going to be a happy ending, a happily ever after ending where Ted reconciles all this and is like, I figured out how to live with you, dear? Maybe.
But no, I don't think so. But that's not. I mean, but that's not Mad Men. But what the show, it's so funny. I mean, it's all kind of a matter of degrees, and like what the show can show you is sort of a fundamental option towards solipsism, right, or sort of towards egoism, or a fundamental option towards sort of other directed, you know what I mean, people who are a little more empathic, right? And like the I don't know, right? And like Don, empathic is not a word that I would use to describe him. I would say Roger is empathic before I would say Don is empathic.
No. Don is the extreme solipsist who only sort of sees everything through himself, at least at this point in his story. And I mean, I guess we're like Peggy is kind of in the middle, right? Where she sometimes thinks about it in terms of herself and her own issues and her own upbringing and her own challenges, but she still is able also to sort of reach out to other people, and we connect with her when she reaches out to other people.
But it's like Peggy's an interesting thing too, because like again, it's like a matter of degrees. Like which side, there are these tensions, right? Like she comes down on the side of her physical safety versus the political commitment that might make her and Abe, right, like want to live on what is it, the Upper West Side or West Harlem or Harlem Heights or wherever the heck they are. At the time, right? Like this, that he's more on the side of the abstract political commitment. She's more on the side of the concrete issue of personal safety. And it's not like she's not, more progressive than Dawn is, or more progressive, I guess, than a lot of the other characters. I mean, if only because she's sort of been very path breaking and kind of boundary breaking herself, but she lean, you know what I mean? It's a question of like leaning, it's yeah, she's leaning in and leaning away.
She leans towards Pete in this episode, and that's the big scene for her, this really fun scene of connection. Although when we're talking about like, well, where do these characters fall along their axis of selfhood and otherhood, it's always notable, especially this season, that the worst misbehavior always tends to happen in the episodes where Joan isn't around. Right? Because like Joan, I mean, I would describe what she does as almost like next leveling this whole idea of empathy, because Joan is also a social organizer who keeps the systems working in such a way that the people even can relate to each other. Right. Like she sort of is a person who by her will and skill forms these frameworks. And it's kind of sad to watch how she sort of has come to disregard herself a little bit. And that's kind of like what last episode was sort of about, was like, wait, what about me? Right? It's like, because she was totally about everybody else. And when she went out with her, was it her sister? Or her friend, when they went out in the town, the episode where they went down into that weird bar with all the lights, and Joan didn't think of herself as attractive, right? Like, which is like ludicrous, right? Like, I mean, yeah, I guess she's a little old for the time period, but it's like the idea that Joan never really thinks of herself as sort of like going out in the town to go have a good time, because that's not the kind of thing that she does, or the kind of person she can be, because she's a mom and her husband is in Vietnam or whatever, her rapist is in Vietnam, whatever you want to call that jerk ass. And she's sort of all about everybody else, but in a way that isn't necessarily ingratiating them, but sort of like interacting with them, interfacing with them. So it's sort of self versus otherhood, but it's not just strictly a sense of empathy. It's also sort of a sense of just like where you frame your efforts, where you see the scope of what you do and think. Because I mean, you can be a sort of other-oriented person and still be very hostile to the people around you. That's definitely the case, and you can cause them a lot of trouble. I'm trying to think
Yeah,
about characters who are like that. I don't know. I mean, like, I wanted to talk about like I don't want to talk about it, but I want to mention like that Chevy dealer guy who kind of like rolled in and was like, all about making everybody do what he wanted. He didn't seem as solipsistic as Don did.
yeah.
He seemed more externally focused. Because if he would look better if he were more focused on himself. Anyway, I'm like ruminating. But there's a lot of good stuff in this episode. Although I think we're kind of running out of time.
Yeah, we
Right?
are. I hate to say.
Yeah. The '60s are giving way to the '70s. The Warriors are approaching rapidly. Um, was there anything else that we wanted to say about this episode? About I don't want to take your juice away. Uh,
It's all my juice.
well, we
I
should
don't
tell
want your
Manolo
juice.
to treat yourself. Wait,
Yeah,
wait,
well, I mean, it's interesting. Do you want to draw a line a little bit between Pete and his mother, and Sally and her father as regards boning, right? Right. That is to say, like, there is something primal about like the intolerability of thinking that your parents are having sex, right?
yeah.
And that, like, with anyone, right? With their, lovely Spanish houseman or their, I don't know, their mistress, like the wife of the guy you kind of have a crush on. And that, I mean, there's an interesting, I mean, in a show that often does like patternings, and things like this, and that's an interesting pattern. And like Pete is sort of empowered to put a stop to it, right? To like sort of ruin her mother's happiness, and like I don't know what's the harm. I guess I see, like, what's the harm.
I mean, it would be really bad because she has pretty severe dementia. So the harm would be that she can't really consent to what's happening to her.
Well, sure.
But
I mean, I
but
guess
it's
it
actually
depends on
happening. If
how
she just thinks it's happening, which is probably the case,
her
because he's trying
her
to
dementia comes in. Her dementia is to a certain extent TV dementia because she does get lucid really fast when they need to make a poignant plot point,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I'd also like to point out that they're doing exactly this story on The Good Wife over on CBS with Mary Beth Peil and her Cuban nurse or something like that, or I'm sorry, I forget the specific ethnicity.
There was a great anachronism I wanted to point out. Like, they don't do these scenes as much anymore on Mad Men, and I'll be fast about this, but like, the old scenes of like, Sally, don't put the dryer bag over your head, you'll ruin it, right?
Yeah.
Or like, let's have a picnic and litter because it's the '60s and people didn't know not to litter. There's the great scene where it's like, well, if you want to go to a ball game, I get tickets to go to the ball games, and and I haven't asked you yet. It's mostly the Mets, and he's like, "Oh, I'm glad you didn't ask me to go see the Mets," right? Because at this point it's 1968, and next year the Mets are going to win the World Series, and they'll be the Amazons. But this year there's still this like horrible joke, right? And so I like that he sort of like slipped that in there, being like, "Man, the Mets are never going to win anything," which also feels kind of funny because of how the Mets are generally. But Met fans, if you're Met fans and Mad Men fans, feel free to talk about the Mets in the comments. I feel like that would be on topic for once, as it were. Oh man, is there any? Should we close this out?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, I feel like
700 foot high and made out of ice because our Game of Thrones podcast went so long.
Oh man, we're just cross pollinating all of these recaps. Yeah, I feel like from 2 hours straight of recapping, we're getting a little tired. So let's leave it there. If you would like to continue the conversation about Mad Men, you can do so in the comments where you can see this video embedded on Overthinking It, which is a website you can visit at www.overthinkingit.com, and which furthermore is the place where we subject the popular culture to a level of scrutiny it probably doesn't deserve.
Degenerate.